My name is Nadyum from the University of Minnesota, and I've been given the honor of framing this message from the collective from the University of Minnesota College of Education and Human Development. And when I initially started or wanted to frame this discussion, I wanted to say something profound. I wanted to have a powerful statement, and I shared it with my colleagues. And each one, from their own lived experience and their own perspective, told me how my statement didn't make sense in this space. And they did it with love. And they gave me advice on how to correct the statement. And as I started to reflect on that, I came to realize that that is why we're here. We're here to try and make sense from our own individual perspectives of the big questions that we have, of statements that should not be said in public. Statements like, if you're a non-white person in the United States, your infant is twice as likely to die. Statements like, if you're a non-white person in the United States, you're 5 times likely to be incarcerated. Statements like, $100 of white wealth. $100 of white wealth is only $5.04 of black wealth. Statements like, there are 8 people in the world who represent or are equivalent to 50% of the wealth of the entire nation. 8 people in the world have the same wealth as 50% of the global world. Those statements should not be uttered in public. And so we have come here to make sense of why those statements are being said and how to correct those statements in this space from our individual perspectives. Because not only should they not be said, but they are wrong, morally wrong, to actually utter in space. And so what you would hear from each person is their perspective of making sense of inequality. But you will also hear remedies and solutions. Because you see, we start to find solutions when we look to see how things are interconnected. And it's at that intersection where we start to correct statements that are wrong. When we look to see how our individual perspectives line up to correct a statement that is uttered, then we find a path forward. So we invite you to listen to our individual perspectives. And then we invite you to connect your perspectives. And let's talk about how they intersect, so those immoral statements can never be uttered again. Thank you.
I'm Oliver Williams, and I'm the first panelist in our group. And what you need to understand with our group is the fact that social and racial justice, family, community, and colonization practices are themes that are going to run through each of our presentations. So with that, that's what we're going to be kind of talking about collectively. What I want you to understand in my presentation, which is about domestic violence in particular, I was talking about comparing African American men and Kenyan men. Because we have so little time, I'm going to cut what I have to say down a little bit more.
Thank you.
And the thing that I want you to walk away with is context matters. And also what matters is the voice of the population that you're serving. If you don't understand the context in which people live, if you don't understand the voice or the interpretations within the community, you miss things. And the outcome can be bad outcomes for the clients that you're working with, whether that's battered women, whether that's working with men who batter. So the thing that I think we need to understand is, if you understand the culture and context, you understand what things to be able to understand and support within each culture, but you also understand which things you need to be confronted and challenged. Not everything in culture is the most helpful thing. I've had conversations with people about different sets of issues, and they say, well, that's a healthy way to be able to deal with things when it does damage to the community. But then the other thing is how we superimpose things from one culture on to the next. So if white people end up developing a model that was crafted around the realities of white people, and then you use it with African Americans, there could be things that you miss. And if African Americans end up using things that are surrounded about our voice only, and you don't realize that you're dealing with, let's say, immigrant and refugees in the United States that are Kenyan, you miss something. The man that does the abuse, or the person that does the abuse, is 100% responsible for the abuse that they do. And they've got to take responsibility for it. They've got to change that behavior. And sometimes they say that men who batter never change. A lot of men who batter don't change, but there's some people who do. And so what I want to do is to keep some hope, and that doesn't mean that they change while he's with the victim. It means that he may change when he's not around her. But we have to believe that change is possible, and we have to make sure that we keep her safe, and to recognize that she may not need to be with him when change happens. His pain around it may be the thing that motivates him to change in other relationships. So I wish I could say more, but with that, I'll be quiet.
Bom dia, meu nome é Oliver e eu trabalho na área de assistência social, trabalhando com violência doméstica. Eu trabalho com homens que batem e abusam mulheres e trabalho com mulheres que são vítimas de abuso.
E eu me sinto muito honrada de estar aqui com vocês, porque eu sou brasileira. Mas vou falar em inglês essa outra parte, ok? Okay, so I'm a psychotherapist and clinical professor at the University of Minnesota. My program of research is focused on the development of ecologically and culturally relevant multi-component interventions for displaced populations affected by traumatic stress, particularly those related to war and organized violence. I work primarily with immigrant, refugee, and other marginalized communities in the US and in post-conflict, low-income settings internationally. I also include populations affected by historical and current persistent traumas, such as indigenous and African communities, as part of this categorization, which carries additional social political dimensions of oppression. I'm going to just go on. So I believe that promoting mental health is a human right and foundational to human dignity. I also believe that part of the remedy to addressing racial, ethnic, and economic inequality with sustainability is linked to being part of a strong, connected family system. The adverse psychological and relational impact of mass traumas resulting from war and organized violence around the world is ubiquitous and has far-reaching implications for prevention and intervention research that promotes a social justice agenda. Although the primary focus of my presentation today is on displaced populations, we must also conceptualize this work to encompass historically oppressed communities. There is broad recognition that we face the largest refugee diaspora since World War II, and we're currently experiencing a humanitarian crisis related to forced displacement. The destructive nature of war-related displacement involves an entire reorganization of individual, family, and social structures, traumatic events in their lifetimes prior to displacement, during, and after resettlement. Most conventional mental health approaches for the treatment of traumatic stress are individually focused, such as post-traumatic stress treatments. However, the lack of evidence and practice-based interventions to support these families and communities also represents a clinical and structural crisis in global mental health. I'm going to not elaborate on all the deleterious impact of traumatic stress on families and communities, but they are quite significant.
By thanking my colleague Dr. Marina for stepping into this impossible role of translating these really hard ideas. I want to thank the organizers. I don't know if Dr. Patricia is still in here, but for organizing all of this and for connecting us to be in community with students and colleagues and friends from all over the world. It's amazing. So my name is Vichit Chun, and I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota. And today I'll be talking about Cambodian deportation in the United States, which I've been teaching about for a long time. And it's been a major issue for Cambodians in the USA since 2002, when the nation of Cambodia began accepting Cambodian nationals from the US. And so I live in Minnesota, the state of Minnesota, and it was a local detention of 8 Cambodians about 2 years ago that drew me further into the issue, that actually drew me into their real lives, in which the government, the state, the US government was going to separate their families. And so I began doing advocacy work with the families ever since. And well, the example I draw from today is from 8 families, 8 Cambodians from the state of Minnesota in the USA. The story begins much sooner than 2002, when the first Cambodians were being deported. Perhaps the story begins in the 1800s, when US immigration laws became explicit about which racial groups could belong to US society. And so questions like, who gets to belong? Who is fit for membership? How does one earn membership in US society? These are important things to consider. And so immigration law, like so many other American laws, are racialized policies. They have to be understood that way. The most infamous example of racialized policy in US immigration is Chinese exclusion. Laws are important because they reflect the values and priorities of a particular society. And so the Chinese Exclusion Act, signed by President Chester Arthur in 1882, is the first and still the only law that prevented people from a specific ethnic and national origin from migrating into the US. This ban would not be lifted for another 100 years, almost 100 years. And so this is important, as Dr. Oliver was saying, this is important context for understanding the current deportation issue for Cambodians living in the US. The majority of Cambodians in the US are refugees. That is, these are communities displaced by war and violence. In their case, or should I say our case, because I'm a Cambodian refugee, we are in the US because the US was in Southeast Asia. The presence of Cambodians in the US is intimately tied to the presence of US troops in our homeland, and intimately connected to the US-Vietnam War, and connected to American empire building. That's the critical irony. And we're seeing this repeated again, as this wild contradiction is present in recent situations with Central American unaccompanied minors, young people leaving Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, that thousands of young people from these regions looking for asylum at the US border only to be turned away, highlights the dangerous contradictions inherent in US foreign policies and inherent in US immigration policies, particularly given the history of US interventions that destabilize these nations, specifically connected to the drug war. So to be clear, laws guiding the deportation of non-US citizens had been in the books, had been around for many years. After September 11th, there were secret negotiations between Cambodia and the US in 2002, and by the end of that year, Cambodians were being sent away. Cambodian Americans eligible for deportation include those who have any felony conviction So any conviction that could trigger up to 1 year in jail. And that could be a lot of things. So that could include serious violent crimes like assault, rape, and murder. But it could also include more petty offenses like property damage and drug offenses. It didn't matter that these mistakes occurred years ago, nor did it matter that these individuals served their time. Many of these individuals had started new lives with children, jobs, and responsibilities to their families and communities. And so something that the US has to come to terms with both historically and morally is that the US involvement in Vietnam included bombing raids to disrupt Vietnamese supply lines in Cambodia and Laos. These were neutral countries, and that these bombings were significant for the political destabilization of these countries. So as my time runs out, this is the context, again, this is the context in which these families of deported individuals come from. And so Cambodians are largely refugees. And the lessons from Minnesota with Cambodian families fighting for their loved ones have been rich. And so I want to just leave with, I'm jumping to the end of my remarks, the very end of my remarks. I'm going to leave you with two, my time is brief, I will leave you with two important things that I feel are important from this talk. And I wanted to get a little more into the organizing, but I won't have the chance to. But the first powerful lesson I learned from these families is, and the organizing was led by women, wives, and daughters, and nieces, and sisters, is that collective compassion is possible. And that in some ways that these individuals were teaching people, all types of people, including myself, how they were to be treated. They were teaching people how to treat them. They push and educate and help many people recognize the humanity of their loved ones, no matter what the state labeled them. And so the Buddhist scholar and monk Thich Nhat Hanh observed, quote, "Only understanding and compassion on a collective level can liberate us." And so these families encourage and practice that. So I'll leave it right there. Thank you.
I want to talk to you just briefly today about the work I've been doing for 25 years at the Lakota Reservation in northern Wisconsin. So if you picture the United States, there's lakes, the Great Lakes in the middle. Our people are all around the Great Lakes, 200,000. About 4,000 people of that many speak Ojibwe in the United States today. We have been divided by the United States treaty-making process, and on the reservation where I've lived for 25 years, there are currently no speakers at all. And now I'm going to take that statement back and say, because of the efforts of a dedicated group of intellectuals, of which I'm just barely a part of, so it's not me, this group does this work. They have started an immersion school called Wadukadaden, and that means the place we help each other. At that place, they have raised over the past 18 years about 70 to 80 young people who are proficient in the language. So now there is 70 times more speakers under the age of 30 than there were 100 years ago. This is a remedy, the name of our conference. This is a remedy. In our language, Ojibwe Moan is a spirit. It's not an object to be conquered. It's not, as it is within academia, separated from language and culture. Those two things are together and they are alive. And it will go on with or without us, and our job now is to figure out if we belong to this place and to this language. I don't know yet what it means in Brazil to be a person of mixed heritage, which is what my identity is. But I know that through speaking the language, many people of mixed heritage identity, which most of us Native Americans are, has pulled us together in very deep and meaningful ways that we probably don't fully understand yet. In our communities, there is a hunger that cuts across race, class, and gender to regain this kind of sense of identity and being rooted in the earth that comes from the learning and passing on of language. Okay, I have 1 minute, so now I'm going to talk faster. I'll tell you just a little bit about some of the things I've done using my university position to create a bridge between community and the university. We've created documentation, materials, learning materials, and books. My current research project is a learning science project where we have elders and the young people I was just referring to walk in the forest with a point of view camera. And what we really want to learn about is the different ways that we as Indigenous people relate to nature. And we believe when we talk about diversity, if we want to get away from superficial differences of skin color, which has been constructed, of superficial things like way of dressing, we need to look deeper into patterns of being. One of the patterns of being that we're finding is distinctly different and needs to be valued. What Nadyum started us with, why is different important? It's different and it's important because it's a different way of relating to this planet, and it brings us back to being human in a way that may hold possibilities for all of us. So doing this research and describing deeply in our language what it means to make meaning of the natural world is one of those strategies. I think I'm out of time, so I'll stop there. Miigwech.
My name is Tania Mitchell, and I study how universities partner with local communities, and particularly the ways that they engage students and faculty in those efforts. And higher education, higher education institutions in the United States have been looking to community engagement strategies as tools to respond to myriad issues of injustice and inequality. We joke sometimes that community engagement is a panacea, that it can be organized to address almost any social ill, homelessness, hunger, inadequate medical care, at-risk youth. There is likely a community engagement strategy to fix it. But I'm concerned that we invest too heavily in strategies that sustain the status quo and that intend to be temporary purveyors of aid rather than ameliorative projects aimed towards social change. We rarely choose community work that includes opportunities that disrupt and transform social concerns. The kinds of service we do in community most often are temporary responses to often intractable social concerns. So for example, a community engagement strategy that seeks to respond to issues of inadequate housing in the community and the people most deeply impacted by that crisis in the most traditional circumstances would have students serving food at a soup kitchen or collecting and delivering supplies to people living on the streets of their city. These are, of course, important and beneficial activities that provide needed relief and raise consciousness regarding the people most impacted by this issue and the realities of their ongoing struggles as individuals without permanent and safe housing options. But these strategies also generally position the university and its students as a beneficent outsider, seeking to help without making any real investment in the issues and the people impacted by them. So imagine instead a change-focused initiative that engaged with social movements working on inadequate housing and chronic homelessness. That a collaborative would press legislators and developers for more affordable permanent housing while supporting individuals towards safe and reliable temporary housing. That involves a public awareness campaign to ensure that the community is aware of the disproportionate impacts of inadequate housing on specific and particular communities, be it poor, disabled, transgender, queer, racially marginalized, while pursuing grants and donations that support change work. One that might call out landlords gouging rent prices or protest banks pursuing unfair foreclosure procedures, a community engagement strategy that includes work to ensure access to regular and culturally appropriate meals, safe drinking water, toilets, showers, childcare, counseling, and short-term financial help. There's likely not a single nonprofit or NGO that does all of these things, but what we've seen from social movements is that work at all these levels is needed to remedy most social concerns. So a university community engagement strategy that I advocate for can partner with movements and involve students and other institutional actors in a variety of roles that respond to the different skills, interests, relationships, identities, and experiences those individuals bring to the project and the work. It connects to a host of academic concepts that can enhance student learning, but also to different community work that can enhance civic, democratic, and political engagement. It does the work of raising awareness and provides multiple strategies of intervention that reveals the complexity of social change while simultaneously providing different possible entry points that allow us to discover our individual abilities to contribute to and recognize the collective responsibility necessary to effect change.
I'm going to spend just a couple minutes talking about social and emotional learning. But I am an educational measurement specialist and very interested in measuring social and emotional learning. Many schools are currently investigating the possibility of using measures of social and emotional learning to help improve school quality and student success. Around the world, countries are acknowledging and have for a long time acknowledged the important role of social and emotional learning to educate the whole child and promote positive youth development. I'm currently exploring SEL, I'll call it SEL for social and emotional learning, SEL data from 29 different countries for students and a little over 20 countries with teachers, because adult SEL is also important. CASEL is the organization that created the term social and emotional learning, maybe in 1994. They say that SEL is the process through which children and adults acquire and effectively apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills necessary to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've learned from the Minnesota Student Survey. This is a statewide survey. In the Minnesota Student Survey, we measure developmental skills like commitment to learning, social competence, positive identity, and developmental supports, such as empowerment, family community support, and teacher school support. And we've learned a few things about how these work in different communities. The goal is to use SEL measures to identify the kinds of opportunities and supports students and staff need to be successful. To acknowledge that learning is a social activity. Students with higher SEL have higher school grades, participate in more after-school activities, and have more positive experiences in that participation. But these opportunities have to be available in order for us to see these positive outcomes. Students with higher SEL, they tend to skip school less often, they are sent to the office for discipline less often, and they are suspended less often. However, for American Indian, Latino, and African American students, they are much more likely to be sent to the office for discipline, and they are much more likely to be suspended. Even though we believe SEL is important for us to understand these outcomes, it doesn't work when the context is inequitable. The predictive power, for example, of commitment to learning is weaker in these communities because of inequitable application of discipline policies. So these measures also tell us that discipline policies are not fair and further limit the success of students, because we see students with higher commitment to learning, much higher, being disciplined at a rate that is very different than what we see in white communities. Systems, structures, policies, and practices must be designed to advance the promise of social and emotional learning in promoting educational opportunity, access, and outcomes for all students. And when done well, with clear attention to individual and community unique characteristics, ways of knowing, ways of doing, social and emotional learning promises to promote more equitable educational experiences and outcomes.
I study how school leaders can be humanizing toward communities, in particular communities that have been marginalized by different historical occurrences in the United States. One of our leaders some years ago asked, does the Negro need separate schools? Not because he felt that there was a necessary or learning space that was different, W.E.B. Du Bois, but rather because he thought that the schools that Negroes would attend would be so violent toward them. So in the many ways that leaders can be humanizing towards schools, I'm going to talk about just one today, a concept that I refer to as identity confluence. Colonial apparatuses that have made people conform with colonial practices and ways of thinking. And I'm talking about people of color now. So colonial Spain had a very dark history, Andalusia, which also included Portugal. I'll talk about this later in the plenary session, but I'll just say now that there was unity, but it was also a forced uniformity, meaning that if you were to exist in this empire, you had to change anything about your identity that went against the monarch of that particular empire. So it's a very dark history. And that spilled over into an American context when General Pratt characterized "kill the Indian and save the man." That was really the function of all schools, to make citizens of the empire. And so how do we begin to address this as school leaders? Well, we have to rely on data, not just the kind of data that most people would be expecting to talk about or see when they go into schools, but I would like to focus on a different type of data, which is community data. Data from the community, voices from parents, from people who live in the community who are not affiliated with the school, and most importantly, student identity, and student data. And that leads me to this notion of identity confluence. Identity confluence recognizes that students come into school and can actually end up doing well, but they're pressured to such an extent, many scholars have written about this, that they end up giving part of their identity up in order to succeed in school. So in this brief talk, that was the introduction, I'd like to talk about hip-hop identity. Hip-hop identity is quite problematic for people in America. They're uncomfortable with the people, and those representations from those people then become problems for them. Hip-hop identity, that people, educators and leaders in America are uncomfortable with hip-hop identity because of the resistance that emerged in the music. But they're also uncomfortable with it because it's a lack of control, it's a loss of control. I argue that when talking about identity confluence, meaning that we accept the identity of these young black kids and these indigenous kids, regardless of if they're sagging their pants or using particular words or carrying themselves in particular ways, that we engage community on the community's own terms, taking information from communities and not ensuring that the relationship is reciprocal. Many times the communities never even read the research that has been written about them. So radical change is indeed needed in education. And in order to humanize schools, we must first start by humanizing students on their own terms and accepting them as they are. Thank you.